Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with roboticists from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, can we trust those robots? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and today's episode is all about robot swarms, and specifically how the coordinated behaviour of many robots working in unison makes people feel. But first, I'd like to remind you to check out the Robot Talk shop at robottalk.org/shop, where you can get your hands on some awesome Robot Talk merch. Share your love for robotics with the world with one of the Robot Talk t-shirts, stickers, or mugs. So, without further ado, let's get on with this week's interview. I recently had a thought-provoking discussion with Razanne Abu-Aisheh from the University of Bristol about how people feel about interacting with robot swarms. This week, I'm chatting to Razanne Abu-Aisheh, a senior research associate at the University of Bristol, researching how people interact with robot swarms. Hi Razanne, wonderful to have you on the podcast.
Hi Claire, thank you for inviting me.
So, your work focuses on how the collective behaviour of many robots working together in a swarm can affect how people feel about those robots. So, What have you found so far?
So as you mentioned, I work with robot swarms, which are basically collectives of robots that interact with each other and the local environment around them through simple rules. And these simple interactions lead to emergent complex behavior where the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. So this gives it a lot of features that are very useful. It makes them flexible, adaptable, reactive, robust, and this makes them quite suitable for many real-world applications, such as environmental monitoring, logistics, search and rescue, etc. And in terms of the technology, swarms are getting technically mature enough to start considering moving them to the real world. So that's where we're at right now. But one of the key challenges in moving these systems to the real world is actually a lack of understanding of public perception. So how people perceive these systems, how will they accept them? So that's why we really wanted to focus on exploring trust in swarm systems. And we were particularly interested in how the way the collective robots move impacts how people trust them. So we were wondering if this kind of more organic, natural movement of swarms actually hinders trust, for example, or impacts the way people perceive these robots. So what we did to evaluate that is we designed a robot cloakroom. So we had a little swarm, 3 robots, and basically participants could just deposit their own personal items, and then the robots would just go and place them in the deposit zone and then retrieve them back to them later on. So there was this element of a little bit of personal investment in the system because they are placing...
You're trusting it with your belongings.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's this kind of level of, what is it doing with my item? What's happening right now? And as I mentioned, we had people interact with the cloakroom, and we had 2 types of collective motions. So one we designed to look more structured, kind of like grid-like motion, 90-degree angles, to give this feel of, they're coordinated, or maybe people think that this looks more efficient. Quote unquote, of course. And then the other motion was more kind of designed to look more like a swarm, so more organic. The robots move at different angles. So they're designed to look like they're reacting in real time to the environment around them. But the motion style was the only difference between the 2 kind of cloakrooms. Everything else, the performance, the time it took to complete, everything else was the exact same. And interestingly, what we found is that people tended to trust both kind of motions At very high levels. The only thing that they seemed to care about the most was the reliability of the system, is that it worked, basically that it did what they're expecting it to do, right? So they deposited their item, they expected it to come back to them safely and securely, and it did. So performance and transparency were things that stood out more than the actual motion style, which is quite promising for robot swarms.
Yeah.
But we only used 3 robots, so just to mention that as a limitation, of course.
I have to say that's quite surprising, actually. I would have expected there would have been some more of a difference. I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of like collective swarm behaviour in nature, right? Because that's the only really reference point we have for this kind of behaviour of many individuals working together, you know? And you think, well, a flock of birds has some kind of emergent behaviour, but people don't find that intimidating. Whereas a swarm of bees, on the other hand, similar collective behaviour, much more intimidating. But maybe that's not the behaviour, that's the threat of the sting. I don't know.
but that's actually, that was one of the points that did inspire this study, because people's perceptions are shaped a lot by what they see, for example, in like movies or sci-fi and nature and kind of like associations with bees, for example. So we were very intrigued to see, like, does this apply to robots? And again, I did mention that it was only 3 robots, because it could just be that if you have 100 of these robots, then the perception changes. But it seems that when the system is associated with a particular functionality, that the focus tends to be on how well the system did what it did, without obviously causing any problems and things like that. And we did give people space to elaborate on their responses. So a lot of people said, well, I could see the system, for example. So that made me feel like I could trust it more.
Yeah.
There was also the element of trust in the developers, because like there's the system, but then there's the people who built it. And because they kind of interacted with us at some level, they were like, well, if I trust the person who designed the system, then I have more trust in the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that point about kind of understanding the system might be quite key there, because maybe what's intimidating about wild swarms is when we don't really understand what they're trying to achieve or what they're going to do. Like, it's that unpredictability that is unnerving.
Yeah, it might feel like a lack of transparency. But also sometimes you know what to expect. So from a swarm of bees, you would know what to expect, and that's why you would kind of avoid them. So that's also something important in like shaping trust as well, is knowing what to expect from a system. Because then you can choose not to trust the system. So if the system is showing behavior that is not trustworthy, you can choose not to trust it and not to interact with it. And that's why it's so important to study these dynamics and to kind of like try to design these systems in a responsible, human-centered way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have plans to kind of repeat this experiment with more robots? Because it would be so interesting to know how that changes with like 100.
That definitely would be super interesting to do. And that is something we would like to explore. But right now I've started working on a few kind of other projects as well. But it's definitely something that I would really love to explore and see.
So you're also collaborating with communities to imagine more inclusive futures with robots. And you recently published an article about the potential for robot swarms in humanitarian applications, such as delivering aid, search and rescue, disaster response. And in that article, you argued for the importance of involving communities in the design and the development of these humanitarian robot swarms. So can you tell us a bit more about this work?
So that article that you're referring to is actually meant to be a kind of reflection on where swarm robotics could be most meaningful. So given, again, the behavior of swarm robots that we talked about before, that makes them very suitable for applications such as search and rescue, humanitarian aid, distribution of aid and stuff like that. But when we come to look into the real deployment of these systems in the real world, like these contexts are extremely sensitive as well. So one thing is them being technically robust and efficient and doing their job well. But then the other thing is, for example, you're going to have people interacting with these systems that are completely traumatized, that are in critical kind of like situations and environments. And the way they react to these systems could potentially be very dangerous and risky if these people are not taken into consideration, and if this mindset is not taken into consideration when designing these systems. So that's why I argue for the importance of community-centered design and human-centered design, where basically we design robots for people with people, or for communities with communities, because that way we get to think about the people who will be interacting with the system from very early on. And the project that I'm working on right now is a step towards that. So I am working on participatory design with communities. So I will be conducting workshops with different kinds of communities where I kind of sit with them and talk to them about how they see and imagine robots in their communities or in their environments in the future, to basically understand what excites them, what they're afraid of, what they would desire when it comes to a robot, what they would like to avoid. So all of those inputs can be taken into consideration when designing such systems. And another interesting thing we'd like to look into is we're going to bring in like our own robots during these discussions. And we'd like to see if bringing in robots actually impacts the way they think of robots, they perceive them, if it kind of gives them some sort of ideas of what kind of to avoid in the future, what they would like, what they wouldn't like. So kind of using them as creative, interactive tools during the workshop process. And again, the idea is, in a whole, to get from this is to involve people in the design of the technologies that they will be interacting with in the future, rather than having them kind of be imposed.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people have very negative impressions of robots, partly, from sci-fi, partly probably from the media. And there is this association of robots and war, robots in, offensive roles, and especially in these kind of very sensitive situations, you can imagine that if that's the only thing you've ever heard or know about a robot, then they would be terrifying.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why it's very important to, I wouldn't say shape that relationship, but it's very important for people to be able to have agency over their interactions with robots as well, to be able to have a level of understanding of what the robots are doing, who designed this robot, who built this robot, why did they build this robot, why is this robot here? Do I trust it? Do I not trust it? To have like a level of nuance in the relationship they have with robots and machines in general. And that kind of like feeds into the point that I said earlier of involving them in the design early on rather than having it imposed on them. Because when something is imposed, you don't feel like you have a say in what it is or in having it in your life. But when you feel like, okay, I was heard, I was listened to, I was involved in it early on, it was explained to me, it's a two-way relationship as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spoken to a few people who've done kind of participatory design approaches in the past for very different areas, and it's quite logistically difficult to organise that. There's also obviously kind of ethical potential considerations. I imagine all of those are magnified tenfold when you're talking about humanitarian aid or disaster response, where the communities you most want the input from are just dealing with so much and are potentially traumatized, as you mentioned. And that's got to be extremely complicated to navigate.
Absolutely. And that differs from community to community as well.
Yeah,
so for example, like the communities that I talked about in the article are probably amongst the most sensitive communities. So for me personally, like I'm not yet at that level of kind of conducting workshops with them. But for example, the ethics process is different. The things that you need to consider is different. Whereas, like, for example, you can think about another community that might actually be quite familiar with robots. Still, like, their input is important because they might have a different view on robots. So again, like, some people might be more open to them. Some people might not want them at all. Like, some people might want them within certain specifications to align with certain values, for example. So it's more about the process itself. The participatory process would differ based on the community, and also the outcome of that would differ from community to community and place to place. So that's why I find it so interesting to explore as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And really important. For a long time, I've thought that robots for these kind of uses makes a lot of sense. And there's relatively little of it that has been done so far. So, it's really important to do this work. So I'm glad that you are, even if it's challenging.
Thank you. It's the future vision that always helps motivate. Like, for me, the main thing is always, I'm very motivated by working in robotics for the purpose of trying to help people. So that's always like the guiding principle for me. So that always does help motivate.
So we have an audience question that is on a similar but almost kind of the flip side of this kind of discussion. So Tim on Patreon says, I'm curious what Dr. Abu-Aisheh has to say about the use of robot swarms in a military and or defence capacity, particularly with respect to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that relates a lot to all the stuff that we've already talked about. And for me, I always aim to keep my work grounded in human-centered design, participatory design, and thinking about people first. So as an engineer, as a researcher, I believe that robots should be designed to reduce suffering and harm and not to cause them.
Yeah.
So for me, any system in general, any machine that is designed with the intent of causing harm or suffering, for me, is not something that I support. And again, like there's always the other side of that, which is robot swarms have so much potential for things that could be potentially so helpful for people, such as humanitarian aid, as we mentioned. And I think that the factor that differentiates whether a robot swarm is going to be helpful or harmful is the intent of the design behind it. So that's why I think it's very important to be very responsible when designing these systems from very early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, with regard to Ukraine, it's kind of happening at the same time as the conflict. So there is an urgency which may lead to people kind of making design decisions that they might not if they kind of had an infinite amount of time to consider these things and it wasn't in the heat of the moment, I guess.
Yeah, I think similar to like many other wars happening around the world right now, there's always the other side, right? So there's the people using the technology and there's the people on the other end of the technology.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the people on the other end are the people who tend to have less of a voice.
Yeah.
So that's why the people who have more of a voice, I would say, would be held responsible for trying to ensure the safety of those that don't.
Absolutely, yeah. These are important topics to discuss, but I also am conscious that I don't want... Swarm robotics is a lot more than just war and military applications. There are many other uses of swarms, so let's not solely focus on the military stuff. Casting your mind into the future, maybe 10, 15 years, what kind of relationship do you envisage for humans and robot swarms? Where would you like to see them deployed? How will we work with them?
So first of all, I love the use of the word relationship in this context, because in the end, it is a relationship like any other relationship, the relationship between humans and robots or machines in general. And like with any relationship, the aim is always to have it be as healthy as possible. And a healthy relationship requires understanding, trust, communication. And so there's two ends of that, right? There's from the machine end and the people designing it, and from the people interacting with it on the other end. So from the design end, as I mentioned, right now, because like we're at such a critical moment where now we're thinking about how to move swarms to the real world and outside of lab settings. So now is a really good moment to include kind of human-centered design, participatory design, and human values into the pipeline very early on. So what I would like to see in the future is like systems that are designed with humans considered into the design from very early stages. From the other end, I would really hope that people can have a kind of nuanced relationship with swarms and robots, so they can kind of look at a robot and be like, okay, I like that robot. I don't like that robot. I trust that one. I don't trust that one, right? So there's this level of agency over the relationship you have with the machine.
Yeah.
And this understanding, like enough of an understanding of the system where it's like, okay, I define how I want to interact with this system. And also one really important thing for me is that I really care about seeing robots deployed in places where they can help people. I really believe in human collaboration with machine rather than competition, right? So I hope to see situations where robots help expand people's capabilities, human capabilities, like they use as tools to expand people's capabilities rather than to try and replace them. So you can have your robot to help you, for example, in logistics, to help you in agriculture, where you have both humans and machines. There, I think, again, you get that emergent complexity of like the whole being larger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like the idea of humans being part of that emergent behavior, I quite like that. You said a phrase that got me thinking, where you said, part of having a healthy relationship with robots is communication. And I think one aspect of swarm robotics that I find kind of a little bit hard to get my head around is how do we communicate with the swarm, you know, like when it's not just you and one robot and you're kind of giving it commands? How do you think in terms of how we should communicate effectively with swarms?
So that's a huge field of research right now, and that's a huge challenge in swarms. And it falls under human swarm interaction because, again, it's like that two-way communication. First of all, how do I interact with the swarm? For example, let's say I want all of the swarm to understand what I'm doing. Like, is it through gestures? Is it through spoken language now with LLMs and stuff like that? Can I just talk to it? What kind of form would that look like? And then the other way is like, how do all the robots understand what I'm trying to communicate, especially if they're scattered all over the place and they're not all within range? Like, is it going to be just wireless communication? Is it going to be... That's actually one of the things where we thought about motion. So like, what if the robots do some sort of collective dance that has a meaning? So there's so many potential ways of communication, but it's a huge area that's being explored right now. And again, it's fundamental to like moving these robots to the real world. So I find it very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if I mentioned this previously, but my background is in social insect biology. So that's why I find swarm robotics really fascinating. And I can't help but make analogies to like bees and ants and think about how they communicate. Of course, the difference there is they don't have like a human that's telling them what to do. And they also don't have some of the technology, you know, they can't wirelessly communicate, or I guess like their best attempt at wireless communication is exactly, yeah. So, yeah, there are some places where the analogy breaks down, but yeah, I find the idea of interacting with robot swarms just fascinating and a little bit mind-boggling. Like, it's such a step change from what we have now.
I see everything as some sort of a swarm or a complex system at least, right? Because, you know, if you think about like how humans communicate with each other, we're collectives as well.
Yeah.
And communication is very important for humans as well. And it's always something that we're like, okay, how do I communicate efficiently? And we have all these levels of like, we have tone and we have emotion and we have all these sort of things. So I think it's when you have that, even when you're talking to another person, you don't know what kind of like background they have. You don't know how they're understanding what you're saying. So there is this level of, okay, how do we reach this mutual understanding and communication?
Yeah.
So I think like just taking that the next step to machines is just an expansion of our capability of communication. And I actually am super interested in the parallel between both. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of research. I could talk about it all day. Razanne, it's been lovely speaking to you today. I've been talking to Razanne Abu-Aisheh from the University of Bristol. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. And don't forget to join the Robot Talk community on Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast and get access to some awesome perks, including monthly bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes updates, merch discounts, and more. Visit patreon.com/Claire Asher and join the Robot Talk community today. Next week, I'm talking to Mark Gray from Universal Robots about collaborative robot arms. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk Season 6 is sponsored by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.